what's up, everyone? We are back for another episode of the Pair Program. I'm your host, Tim Winkler, accompanied by my co-host, Mr. Mike Gruen. Mike, how are you doing, sir?
I'm doing all right. Still getting over last night's loss by the Rangers to Carolina, but, hanging in there.
Nice. Yeah, I love that we talk about topics that aren't going to be relevant when this episode's released.
I'm well aware that it's
when the Rangers are far gone from the playoffs. But no, it's been a pretty exciting. So for those that aren't aware, Mike is a huge New York Rangers fan. Rangers are in the playoffs, and it's coming down to the wire here.
Yeah.
Well, cool. Well, yeah, let's talk a little bit about what today's episode is going to take us through. So, a pretty common scenario in startup world is going to some sort of an exit, right? So either IPOing or getting acquired. Getting acquired being the more common theme for many startups, and we're going to hear firsthand from a couple of our guests on maybe some of those expectations in that type of scenario, but more importantly, kind of dissecting what these different environments may look like for a technologist that is going through different stages of startups or going from startup world into maybe like a large enterprise or a big tech company. So we do have some good guests with us today who have great experience when it comes to this topic. So Damien and Nick, thank you guys for spending some time with us today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
For sure. So, before we dive into the discussion in pair program form, we do like to kick things off with a fun segment that we call Pair Me Up.
Pair me up.
This is where we will go around the room and pretty much shout out a complimentary pairing. And so I always like to kick things off with Mike. Mike, why don't you lead us off here on a good pairing for you?
Yeah, I don't know how good it's going to be, but I took a recent trip to New York City and was reminded I always go up. I live down in the DC area, take Amtrak. And my go-to move is to get in the cafe car because it's like having a whole work desk space. So I'd say like Amtrak in the cafe car, you can just sort of work and, it's better than the business class. You can really stretch out. There's usually nobody else sitting with you or maybe one other person. So that's my go-to move at the risk of blowing that up. And next time I go up to New York, the cafe car being completely full. But so that's my pairing. Not overly controversial.
Yeah. I don't think that's a hot take anybody's going to debate you on. I'll go with, I'll jump in here. So I'm going to go with dogs and consistent schedules. And something that, I've had dogs always growing up. I've got a 2-year-old Swiss Mountain Dog. Her name is Basil. And she is so timely that it shocks me. The time that she wakes up is, that 7 o'clock on the dot, knows that it's breakfast time to, right around lunchtime. As soon as I finish my lunch, she's pretty much nudging me because she knows that's kind of like the walk time. And then dinner is at 5 o'clock. So I'm going to go with dogs and consistent schedules. I think it's remarkable how she has a more consistent routine than I have. So
I think that's interesting because a lot of pets, dogs, cats are the same way. They're very they know what time it is.
I didn't know that about cats.
Yeah. If you want to get out of a habit or whatever, you can do it at the same time as feeding your cat or whatever, and they'll remind you. It's just they're very consistent. Same thing with dogs. I had dogs growing up too, but yeah,
it's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
Cool. Let's pass it over to our guest, Nick. Why don't you give us a quick intro on yourself and then lead us off with your pairing?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Nick Halm. Right now, I'm the VP of engineering for a startup in Minnesota called JustiFi, and we're building a payments orchestration platform. So, kind of a big body of work there. But this is my second go in a payments company. Previously, I was at Sentinel and have been at quite a few startups before that. So, excited for the conversation. My pairing is going to be actually sort of similar. It's that mornings and working out, like if I am going to work out, it has to happen immediately after I wake up, or it doesn't matter if I have hours open somewhere else in the day. It will not happen if I don't do it right away. So that's mine.
I love that. Yeah, I've recently transitioned over the last year to morning routine workouts versus after work, and it's game changing in terms of like energy throughout the day, but also the last thing you want to do like after a long day's work is more work. And so like knocking it out first thing is, I agree. It's a game changer. It's tough. It's tough to get into it. But once you got that week or two under your belt, yeah, it's the you gotta have it. Cool. Good stuff. Damien, how about a quick intro on yourself and your pairing?
Sure. So I'm Damien, and I'm a senior research software engineer at PwC. The team that I'm on, we work on a graph analytics platform that operates over time series data. And my pairing is also not a hot take, and it's almost a little bit cliche given that I have like guitars sitting behind me, but it is having music while writing code. Because I think every problem has a soundtrack.
I was going to ask, what is there like? What genre of music does it depend on what you're working on? Because I definitely have certain genres that I use for different things.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it definitely depends on the problem, but there are themes. Like I tend to listen to more instrumental music and more like technically challenging music, if that makes sense. You know, like jazz or some like progressive metal or something like that. So just kind of like, I don't know, that somehow in my mind, there's a pairing between the structure of the music and the structure of the thing that I'm trying to work on.
Oh, interesting.
So I can totally relate to that as well. I mean, I'm not coding, but in the recruiting world, when I used to get deep into some internet research and doing some sourcing, I had to have, my thing was instrumental music. So I was huge on like Hans Zimmer and just getting down on like some Gladiator soundtrack.
Yep.
Just getting super motivated. And it also is like I resort to that when it's like just a gloomy, rainy day. Like I'll throw down on some instrumental and just mellow out a little bit more in front of the computer screen. But yeah, I would imagine coding, you're getting into some sort of music there to get you through it.
Yeah, for sure. It's not always an instrumental too. I definitely have a heart for pop music and everything too. It's
nice.
I just consume everything.
That's cool.
Yeah. Taylor Swift and coding. That's a next hot pairing.
Yeah, 1989. Man.
I mean, I will say I'm pretty impressed with us. That I think this is the first time we've had 4 pairings that don't involve food. So that's interesting.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, we get creative points for that. Cool. All right. Let's jump into the heart of our conversation here.
Let's dive in.
That's a fairly new soundbite there. We'll see if that's going to make the cut or not. So yeah, as we mentioned, we're going to be talking about some of these different environments that technologists experience. From startup to enterprise, and oftentimes, it's not by choice, right? So when we think about, acquisitions as an example, right? When you sign up for a startup environment, you're signing up for a smaller, smaller org, and maybe a little bit more of this nimble type of environment. But of course, like the fate of many startups, is going to be some sort of an exit. So like I mentioned, an acquisition is common. Damien, you went through something not too long ago. I'd love to maybe start, with your story for some context, to maybe just walk us through a little bit more about, your most recent startup experience, and then what, these last couple of environments have looked like for you and how they've differed.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I guess the first caveat to just put out there is, everybody's experience of this process is going to be totally different. And so, I mean, both for my current employer and the startup that kind of got absorbed into my current employer, I can only speak for my own experience of doing this stuff. But yeah, it's kind of the background of our story was we were started as an IoT focused startup working on analyzing temporal graph data just to, execute machine learning algorithms on IoT data, which is like a big thing nowadays. in the course of the time that I was at the startup, we were called Signal Frame. We grew from a team of 7 or 8 people all the way up to about 28 or 29. And then on our way towards an exit, we scaled all the way back down to about 8 or 9 people. And then we went through the acquisition process, and then were immediately put into a group at PwC Digital, which is, I want to say, like 15,000 people on the order of. So a very large just organizational change in the time that I've been there, for sure.
And I think it's interesting, like when you talk about acquisitions, there's a few different reasons why a company gets acquired by another company. Whether it's because of the people, the technology, sometimes it's because the acquiring company it's a competitor and they just want them off the market. So it's sort of like, we're going to acquire you and then shelve you and stuff like that. So I'm sure that also has a much bigger impact on what people's experiences are. I've experienced a couple different acquisitions. For you, it seems like PwC was coming, or for you guys, what was the motivator? Was it what you guys were building, the people? I'm just a little curious.
Yeah, exactly. So when our acquisition happened, it was based around, there were kind of 2 halves to it. There was the IP, which was the technology that we had worked on and continue to work on now, and then the personnel as well, because they recognized that kind of the team that built this technology, there are some novel aspects to it, and it was worth the investment on their part to say, that's the way that I like to think about it is they were saying this is how, the true valuation of what we're acquiring includes, the skill set of team members A through E or whatever.
Right.
And I think that was a really good motivator. I don't know that it would have worked out as well as it had if it had only been based around the IP or something like that.
Right. I think that's an important part, right? That's like the ideal situation, right? They're coming because they want you, they want the people, they want the IP, they want the technology.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Were they building their own product at the same time, their own similar thing, or was that? This is just
no,
new?
No, they didn't have anything exactly comparable. And that's one of the challenges that we face, was just like finding the right fit. I mean, whenever you're working on any technology that's like significantly different than what's already being used, it's always a challenge to kind of connect the ideation funnel, from product folks and sales folks, especially in an organization that's quite large. And they have a lot of, there's a lot of mechanism around what they're used to building with, whether it's technology or just like conceptually what type of products they're looking to create. So that definitely has been a challenge, is figuring out like where our special tech fits into the larger picture at PwC.
Right. How do you just get the skew on the on the
list? Yeah. Honestly, that's like half the battle is just being able to explain things properly and just help people understand. That's a big challenge.
Yeah, and then Nick, I'm going to jump to you in just a second, but on another piece to that story, Damien. So one of the things that I think of too is like, at Signal Frame, right, when you were interviewing folks to join the tech team, you probably had your own, process and, a different kind of culture that maybe you're looking for to make sure that they kind of mesh with this small, intimate environment. Mm-hmm. Going to PwC, one, did they tell you like, look, we're still going to support growth of the team, like hiring, like we're still going to allocate resources for you all to scale out or build. And then did they let you kind of maintain some of your own processes from like how you did interviews, or were they kind of like coming in and saying like, no, now they're going to talk to this VP of technology over in this department here too? Or I'm just kind of curious on how that transition was.
That's a great question. It's definitely a little bit different now, although thankfully, like our team, the way that our core team has been able to bring people on board at the very last step when we're able to select from between a few candidates, we've been given all of the kind of space we need to sort of do things exactly the way that we did when we were independent. I think the main difference is that the larger pool of people, it's not just coming from all over the place. It's not coming from recruiting websites and direct contacts, friends of friends. Like the talent pool is very different, because they'll have they'll have a group of people that's quite a bit smaller than we might have had applying as an independent company. But those people have already gone through like a bunch of interviews potentially, or other processes, or they come from some special contracting vehicle that brings people on a temporary basis. So there's just a lot more machinery behind kind of before they get to us. But we've been lucky in that we can still sort of check if people are interested in the technology. Yeah. I actually found like for our team, I guess partially because of what we're working on, we're almost like a bigger part of the culture fit. It's not so much whether you want to hang out with us. It's just whether like, do you like this type of technology, and like, are you going to push yourself on it? And I think sort of being forced to be virtual has made, I noticed that when new people are coming in, it's sort of, it's less, there's less of the thing that happened in the office where you sit down with someone and you just get like a vibe. That doesn't happen so much anymore. So I think that's been pretty different for us too.
Yeah, it is different. It's like for us here at Hatch anyways, it's like, personality match is super important. Like we want to make sure, we can joke with you and not, nobody takes themselves too seriously here. And, maybe that's not as important of, in larger environments where it's like, you're not going to be interacting with that person maybe as frequently, or, crossing, paths with them in the hallway or whatever it might be. But, just an interesting transition. So, Nick, let's jump into your scenario, because, a little different, not necessarily, acquisition, but, why don't, for context for the listeners here, telling us a little bit about, your experience of, how your environment progressed through, your experience with Sezzle coming in, and then what you built that to, and then we can talk about, where you're at currently.
Yeah, I think the Sezzle experience was pretty unique for me. When I got there, I had one employee. Which was pretty amazing for a payments company, and that was the payments team. So we started out under a lot of pressure, but by the time I left, which was just about 3 years, that was, I had 25 people on that team, 4 different teams, and definitely had built teams that specialized in the things that they were doing. Like in payments, you have, issuing and acquiring and international payments and stuff, and all the accounting. So it was a really fun process to be able to build that team. And I was in a nice environment where like that was really on me, how I wanted to hire people. I really had the final say of like who was gonna be on the team or not. And it was a lot nicer once I had more people and some managers, and then they could really go through the process and kind of see their autonomy in building their teams out how they wanted as well. That was really fun. So I enjoyed that process. It was my favorite part, but definitely going through, whereas like Damien had this, all of a sudden one day he's in a huge company. We went through this slow build of like, oh, now we have, 400 or 500 people as an org internationally. Like, how do we operate? That was trying at times. Definitely, I think, especially for people that had been there from early days. Later on when you're hiring people and you're at that like 400 person mark, people don't expect to have a whole lot of communication with every single person around them anymore. So the expectations changed over time, and sometimes it was definitely easier, I think, for incoming folks once we got that far.
So you were the first kind of engineer hired?
No. When I got there, I think I was about employee 70. There was one person there on the engineering team that was like fully dedicated to payments. So I got brought in to build that team out, and
I guess
it was pretty fun. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's interesting you contrast like, because I've also gone through the experience of like the growth, the slow growth, the big company comes in and acquires all of those different things. And I think it's interesting, like the engineers that started early on, and as the company grows, I feel like when it's that growth and it's just sort of gradual and organic, it's harder for some people to sort of like recognize like maybe this isn't the organization I still want to be at. Like they long for the days of like, yeah, I knew everything that was going on and I was super like we were all connected and so on and so forth. And then you go to like the other extreme where it's like, yeah, one day you're 10 people or whatever, and then the next day you're 2,000 or however big. And I think it's harder for my perspective or my experience. In that second case, it's the acquiring company that doesn't like fully recognize that like these people that you just grabbed, like they come from a small company, they have certain expectations, and like maybe they don't really want to work at this big company where like all of these where it feels very heavy and process and blah blah blah. And you sort of, I don't know if either one of you have like thoughts on that, but like that to me is like when it comes to like the engineering mindset, and like that's where there's some struggles, is like whether you're the engineer and you go through this growth or you come in one day and like everything's changed. I don't know.
I've gone through that too, where like one of the first companies I worked at, we were acquired by in this sort of complicated deal with Rite Aid. And it was fairly obvious from the beginning that the idea was the opposite of what I think that Damien experienced, where it's like, okay, we're going to keep you together and we like you as a group of people. It was sort of like, we need your technology. We'll keep a handful of you out of necessity. But the rest of it is like, I mean, literally going through things where their teams are saying, oh, well, we're going to rewrite that and we want to do it in Perl. It's like, well, it already works in this. Like it is running, some sort of crazy thing. So that was, needless to say, not a great experience. So,
yeah, I'm curious, Damien, like with your experience, like what did they have expectations on you guys in terms of like how that would go? Like, did they think that like, oh, everybody's going to be super excited about working at this giant company now? Or did they sort of recognize that like, this is actually going to be a pretty big cultural shift for some of the people that are actually at the company that's being acquired?
Yeah, I think they did right by us by kind of recognizing that it was going to be a very big change, just because the nature of like PwC is a very big organization, but it's also structured a little differently. Like I've worked at some large companies in the past. I worked at a place called Cvent, which is like a big event management software company. But that was a very, like, I would say traditionally structured company. Like I imagine they modeled their organization a little bit after the big tech companies like Facebook or Microsoft or whatever. But PwC is one of the big four consulting companies. And so their entire model of like what their business culture is, including for software engineers, is just super different than anywhere I've worked at elsewhere. And I imagine people who work at other consulting firms may have had similar experience, because every big consulting firm is diving really deep into tech as they have to. So they understood that. They understood that it was going to be a pretty big shock for us. And I think that it's gone very smoothly. Like the things we sort of lose, at least in my experience, from going from the startup into the big organization, one of the big things is just like a control over time. Like it was easy to not appreciate that when we were an independent, tiny team, like our schedules were just tied up together because we were all in the same place, working on the same tasks at the same sort of rhythm. But then when you jump into a bigger organization, there's just literally more people to work with. And so you have to manage people's schedules, and that bleeds into like project deliverables and all kinds of stuff. So I noticed like kind of the pace of our workflow definitely changed. And I think they did their best bringing us in, but it's just always going to be a challenge, because that's like where it like really hits home is in the work that you're doing. Just like Nick mentioned, like they have only developers who work in technology XYZ, like .NET or something like that. They're like, oh, can we rewrite this thing in .NET? And we're like, no, we really don't want to do that. And that sort of thing,
well, at least they're not. At least they're not still trying to push Perl on you. That would be.
Yeah, that's true. Although I don't know. Have you worked with any large C# code bases? It's like I might prefer Perl, honestly.
I'm kind of curious on if this is even brought up in in the interview of maybe with Signal Frame as an example, or Nick with your experiences at Sezzle, is like how much transparency is communicated about the growth plan of getting to an exit event. I feel like that's a sensitive subject, right? Obviously, it's an unknown, but there's tends to be some sort of a plan that probably the founder has in their mindset, and there's probably a roadmap that's somewhat aligned with this progression. To what extent do have either of you all ever brought that up in the interview process of like what is it, what is my expectation here? But then that 5-year plan, that's always a question that I kind of laugh at. 'Cause, like, as a founder, I'm like, can't tell you the 1-year plan, sometimes here. And, but, if it's, impacting your role, and like I said, like you sign up for a certain stage and knowing that you want to get to a certain stage, I guess how much of that is like broached on an interview process, or is that something that the founder, like, pulls you in and like, hey, just a heads up, we might be doing this thing in a year that we're having these conversations around. How much transparency was brought forth to you all in the scenarios of the how fast you're planning to grow?
So I can speak to Signal Frame. So we were lucky in that I remember when speaking to the founders, going through the interview process myself. They were just very transparent about the fact that they would always give us, and not just during the interview process, but also like through the course of our employment, they would always give us the maximum timetable or runway or whatever you want to call it that they could reasonably back. And I think that was a really honest way to do things, where they would say like, hey, we have an 18-month plan, but honestly, we don't know what direction certain things are going to go in that time frame. So you can set your expectations accordingly. And I really appreciated that. And I think that helped motivate a lot of our core engineering team sticking around for a long time, which just made our software better.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that's more relevant as the team is still smaller. I think, once you get into a bigger org, those questions, I mean, one of the things is like, if you're public, you can't really talk about it anyways. Mm-hmm. so that kind of puts an end to it. But, once you're bigger, there's so many moving pieces that I don't feel that it's quite as relevant as long as you have runway. But I know for me, like I will ask that question, but I think that makes more sense when you're at a higher level within the company to understand really who are the people that you're going to work with, and what do they see as the vision. But to your point, though, Tim, is like how much do you know? Like you have an idea, but it's really 12 months out in like a pre-seed, like a Series A or B company. Like that's pretty hard to know.
But I mean, I think to the earlier point about transparency, I think when I asked that question, right, even when I was really early in my career, I remember my mentor giving me that advice of like, ask that, like, find out what their exit strategy is. Like, what are they planning on doing? Mm-hmm. Like, and the answer, the specific answer isn't as important as the way in which it's delivered, if you will. Like, if they don't really know, if they don't really have a plan, are they saying like, hey, man, this is what I know. I know like the next 6 months, this is what we're going to try and accomplish. And then 6 months after that, this is what we're going to do. And like, maybe that leads down path A and maybe that leads down path B. Like our doors are open, like blah, blah, blah. Like it's really about that level of transparency and sort of how they react to that question more than the actual specific answer, if you will. Mm-hmm. And I've always appreciated that transparency. I would much prefer someone tell me, hey, all options are available. Like we, or no, our plan really is like, we see ourselves in 5 years. We really want to just be acquired. Like we want to build something that like really like, which no one's ever said to me. Like it's usually the latter of like, we want to be open to wherever things take us. But I think it is important. I think it's a valid question to ask. I don't know how important it is. It's really up to you to decide how important it is to you to know that stuff. But I think it's
well. I think I also respect the question because it's clearly somebody's concern thinking about their future too, right? Because it's not just the company. It's like, where do I fit in as well? Because that's, I think, a bigger, piece of this theme of this topic is, your role is going to be changing, regardless. And so you need to think through what is it that you are comfortable with, and then what are your expectations of where I'm going to be going at that next stage. So we get this round of funding in a year, if that's what you're saying is in this milestone that we want to get to. We got to get the team to this stage and the product at this point. But then what are my options? Because there's going to be a hiring spree, I'd imagine. And then, it's almost like broaching that early on and just trying to map out as best you can, even if they're not going to tell you like, yeah, after that, we're getting acquired, but it's like, okay, well, if you want to run this, this team, like we're going to have these new features that we're exploring. We'll probably need somebody to manage the people, or you could just go down the principal, path, whatever it might be. But at least you're showing me that you're concerned, you're interested, and want to know what my options are. So just something that's almost like underlying asking without asking what your path might be or what it might look like.
Yeah, I think Nick brought up a good point, which was that I think part of the reason you tend to ask, you tend to speak about that aspect a little bit less in a bigger organization is that one of the biggest changes we noticed was kind of in our search for new product applications for our technology. Everything just had like an unlimited staying power because we weren't so concerned with the next quarter or the next 18-month, runway plan. We could really like let different proofs of concept or other sort of explorations of the application of our tech. We could do that in a more comfortable way than we could have when we were a startup. And I think that it has its pros and cons, but I think that was a positive change for sure. Moving to a larger organization, it was like less scrappiness a little bit, and maybe less worrying about keeping the lights on. Like we could actually focus on the tech to some degree more, but very different.
The other question I've been asked, and I found interesting, especially in the last few years, is really being asked what the career ladder is very early on, and that definitely happened more at Sezzle, where we were a bigger org. Further through the my time there, where like at an early stage startup, people aren't really asking you what the career ladder looks like, and what are your fixed review processes and things like that early on. So that was always been a pretty good question, I thought, when you're in a little bit larger company.
I think it can also be a differentiator if you're one of the smaller companies, to have a little bit of that and to be able to speak to that, because I think that is something that speaks to certain people, and I think having that, being able to answer that can help a startup sort of differentiate a little bit from some of the other startups where it's like, hey man, like we don't know, like whatever, like we just need somebody to ship some code, like just come on.
I actually was asked this last week, so now it's on my agenda to build the ladder. So
there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's something that we hear quite a bit on the podcast. Actually, is these the different styles of roles, and people are really dissecting them a lot more, right? So like we've got an episode centered around like what is this role of principal or staff engineer. Because it's something where, it's a super senior role, but then, it's almost like I'm not taking the CTO's seat next, and I don't want to manage people. Where do I go from here? And trying to understand, how it is that you're baking in like that next step for folks, even though maybe it looks like that's like one of the top you can get to.
Yeah.
I know that's something that we're trying to dissect here is like, we can't really go beyond that right now because we're not at that size. So I can't really tell you like this is going to be a people management slot or not. We're not there yet, and I don't know how much we're going to really invest in that department. But it's just interesting to see like a lot of people are really tapping that right now and wanting to, make sure that there is a career path in place and what their options are laid out.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting how many, like a lot of the people that I talk to that are more junior or earlier in their career thinking a very linear sort of progression. When I know from my experience, I'm sure you guys would agree that like it's anything but linear. Like I zigzagged up that mountain, like, and there were a lot of switchbacks. There was a lot of going back down, and so sure, you guys have similar experiences and have to sort of educate people as well.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. It went from before Sezzle being a CTO and building a company from, the 20 plus or almost 30 engineers total, and like then going back and like, okay, now I'm in code every single day, like all day, and it wasn't exactly what I was hoping for in long term, but it definitely was like a clear path, right? So it was worth it to me to be able to say like, all right, let me dive into this again and get back in code and then be able to work that way up. So that overall a good choice, I think.
So Nick, when you joined Sezzle, what was it? Was it like a Series A at that stage?
It was right after they had gone public. That company went public on the ASX, which is Australian Stock Exchange. So it was the BNPL space was very well understood in Australia, and that was really the impetus of going public there instead of here in the US. So from the whole time I was there, actually we were public. It was an interesting thing because the company was so small as a public company still.
Yeah.
But as I'm sure a lot of people have noticed, that space has exploded so quickly that you really had to have a huge runway to be able to grow as fast as you needed to become competitive. So it did make sense. And now right after I left, they were just acquired by Zip as well. So that was a pretty short, I mean, in the grand scheme of a company, like that was a pretty short go of it, but before getting acquired, but I mean, congratulations to them. It was a big deal.
And then currently you're is it seed or A?
We just closed the seed, kind of had a 2-phase seed, I guess. We closed in December, and then another opportunistic investor came in April. So we're building the plan. Hopefully we have a pretty good runway until there's a real need for an A right now.
And what's the size of the engineering team?
Yeah, the engineering team today is pretty small. So I came in and acquired a very senior team, which was interesting. Not something I experienced before. That had really worked together for quite a while. So that I was lucky to inherit a team like that. And right now we have just about 8 people, I think.
So any like standout attributes that you feel like you've pulled from your previous experience and at that stage when you joined versus where you're at currently within those two environments? Is it anything that jumps out as drastically different to you, and what would those be?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about being at a seed level company is just your product is still really a work in progress, and what is hard sometimes is that you build something and you're close to it and you're super proud of it, and it's hard to like either find out that wasn't really very relevant, or that like you still need to make some more tweaks on that for it to reach its full potential. So I think I had kind of forgot a little bit about that since I had a fairly established product for 3 years, and hadn't been in that like first day, first line of code thing like I was at Tredium before. So it was it was a little quick refresher for me once I got there, but it's definitely all about just like how quickly can you fulfill some requirements of your early adopters, right? So
very cool. All right, I think we're about ready to transition to our next segment here. So let me just pull this list up here of questions that we crowdsourced from the Hatchpad community, and this next segment here is called Round Out My Career. So it's a fun segment where we spin this community wheel behind me. It has topics and questions, like I mentioned, crowdsourced from the Hatchpad community. The topics can range anything from compensation to culture. So let me give it a spin and see what today's topic is.
Let's round it out.
All right. Goals is the topic here. All right. Let me just see. Okay, let's go with this one. So, how do you promote creating and tracking goals that are not just performance based? Damien, why don't we start with you? Anything specific that comes to mind?
Sure. I guess to ask a question about the question, do we mean like in? Yeah. Okay. So I guess it's the main way to set goals that aren't performance based. I think it requires having some structure around what you say your culture is. We were at Signal Frame. We had actually, one of the co-founders had written this down, like had a culture document. And we carried the practice into our current team. But I think without that, you definitely don't have that as much in the startup space. It's kind of the goals are necessarily performance driven, and you have to. There are many instances where you get asked to drop what you're doing and go do something else. I think that happens less at a larger organization post acquisition. So it really comes down to just having other structures like HR departments, and there's kind of career building, ideas or platforms that exist in the organization that just wouldn't be there in a startup context. And those help kind of drive those goals because they sort of flesh out that where do you see yourself in 5-year question, or at least that's the goal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How about yourself, Nick?
That's kind of a hard question, I guess. I think I could agree when it's a larger org, that's a little bit easier. Having the extra resources helps a lot. I know I don't really have a great answer for this, honestly. So, yeah.
Mike, what do you?
Yeah, I mean, I think about like the career goals, or if there's areas. I mean, you have one-on-ones with folks, and you sort of learn about what they're interested in, and looking for opportunities for them to grow, and opportunities for them to get better or to do something different. I don't think it's necessarily performance based. It's really about sort of like, well, what do you want to be exposed to, and setting up some goals and measuring against like, okay, how are we going to find you those opportunities? Like, hey, you've talked about, you're still early in your career, or maybe you're sort of midway through, sort of you've been around a little bit and you want to start managing people. What are the skills that you sort of need for that, and how do we get you exposed to that and get you sort of maybe you're like me and you thought you really wanted to do that early in your career and you did it and you realized it's a mistake, and how do you sort of back out of that and or whatever, and then get back into it later or whatever. But I think that's where it's a lot of conversations. I think for a smaller company, right, where you don't have that HR department, where you don't have those career ladders defined, where you don't have all those other sort of goals, or it might just be as easy as having a conversation about certifications, and encouraging people to go out and learn and train, and like you can then just track and say like, hey, we talked about this quarter you wanted to try and get such and such cert, like how's that going? So I think you can do some stuff around that. That's actually measurable and is a real goal that really helps them and helps them drive their career. That's outside of sort of the shipping code.
I think in that vein too is like what I generally coach people on is as well as, hey, one of the most important things if you're talking about moving up, like in that sense, is really keeping track of those things on your own as well.
Yes.
Like, you are your biggest advocate. And even if you have a manager that is just all into getting you promoted or helping you make that lat move or do whatever it is you're trying to do, like, it's really up to you to build that case for them before they're able to present anything. So I really do, especially when I'm onboarding new people, kind of say like, hey, do me a favor and keep track of everything that you do in the next 90 days at least. Because when you're frustrated, you can look at that and be like, hey, things aren't so bad. I am moving forward, and that really extends through the rest of your career.
Yeah, this question's first off tricky. Thanks for teeing us up with this one, Thomas. It's like not really even sure what this means. So to zigzag on the question, I would say that Mike, you brought up a good point about like how do you better yourself? How do you round out like just your skill set? So
round
like
out your career, maybe.
Round out your career. Yeah. I think like the certification piece is good, but then I would also add like so trying to just be mindful of how much work folks are doing in certain intervals, right? Because with our company, it's cyclical, and so trying to align with like burnout and understanding like when are you overdoing it or when are you underperforming, and trying to plan out like one, like make sure you take we rolled out like mental health days as a result of the pandemic, actually, of just like take some time to just, it's not all about work here, make sure like you're holding yourself to that day. So our HR person sends a reminder out. It's just like make sure you block it on the calendar, try to put it out there in advance just so we can kind of work around that schedule. But also just trying to figure out your schedule and taking time off when it's not going to have a huge impact on the company, but trying to do it tactfully and explain that it can be tricky. So this balance of like burnout, but also like, look, we're a small company and we need you to be heads down right now. So I guess where I'm zigzagging to is setting time for yourself that's good for you to kind of unwind and do your own thing, and then being prepared to buckle down when we need you to, and trying to make that a part of like they're almost like how they set up their schedules as a goal, because it certainly plays a part in our business if everybody's taken off at the same time, like during our busy season, and we find ourselves in a pinch. It's kind of a debacle. But
another big thing there too is like if you're in a stage where you're trying to figure out what's next, or maybe even if you want to go from engineering to product or something like that, like I really suggest finding it like an external mentor, not somebody at your company that's really close. Like that makes a big difference on how you can actually speak and have an open conversation about what's going on and what's going on in your head versus what you can do within it, somebody within your company.
Yeah, I can't agree with that more. Like, I feel like the idea of like mentors versus like I can coach people, I can help people who are at my company, right? But like true mentoring is definitely like I benefited the most from my mentor who was out, it's external. I reported to her for a while, then I left, was at a different company, and then she was able to be really my mentor throughout most of my career. I couldn't agree with that more. Like getting some of that and getting that from outside to help you set those goals that are maybe not performance based from the company's perspective. It's super helpful.
Yeah, likewise. I feel like you have to find people who inspire you.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we did something similar here. We're like trying this type of mentor program for, we don't have a product, department, but our marketing, team wants to be, more product savvy. So we engage a product advisor almost in a sense to meet with us monthly, versus, hiring a product person, and try to gain that knowledge through the use of a mentor advisor. And better use of our spend, but also, still satisfies that need to, round out their skill set, but do it by way of mentors or, consultants. So cool. All right. I think that's a wrap on the episode. So I wanted to thank both of you guys for spending some time with us. Certainly an area that we can have many more conversations about. I'm sure, this won't be the last time you all experience this type of transition and an environment. So would love to pick it back up at another date. But for now, thanks for spending time. And if there's anywhere specific that you want to shout out where folks can follow you, if it's on Twitter, YouTube, LinkedIn, go for it now. Otherwise, we'll just post it in the show notes after the fact.
Yeah, I'm just have the LinkedIn. Can't do more than one.
Yeah, I don't blame you.
Yep. So I'm a Damien Stanton pretty much everywhere.
TikTok,
Cool.
Yeah. Not TikTok. Yeah,
He's starting viral videos.
Too old for TikTok now.
Too old, exactly.
Good stuff. Well, that's a wrap. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.